Just one witness.
Maybe
It's just an idea.
Yeah.
Okay, so the state having rested their case, defense ready to present evidence?
Yes, Your Honor. Defense will call Dr. E. Lopez. May I proceed?
Go ahead.
Could you please introduce yourself?
I'm Dr. Elias Lopez.
And what do you do for a living?
Currently, I'm a forensic pathologist, which basically means I look at dead people for a living, if you're curious. I also co-founded my own private consulting firm, Forensic Pathology Experts.
And did you do anything prior to that?
Yeah, I was chief medical examiner for about 20 years, where I conducted over 1,000 autopsies.
What kind of education did you need to have to hold those positions?
I received my BS in Biomedical and Health Sciences from Purdue University, as well as my MD from Emory University School of Medicine.
So why are you here in court today?
The legal team for Jordan Ryder had asked me to analyze and conclude Parker's time of death, as well as cause of death, and if the autopsy contained any scientifically significant omissions.
Did you have sufficient facts and data to reach a conclusion?
I did.
What facts and data did you analyze specifically?
I analyzed Parker's medical records, as well as the autopsy and the conclusions and addendum drawn by Dr. Quincy.
And you use methods that are commonly relied upon by other experts in your field to reach that conclusion?
I did. That is standard in my field.
And what methods were those?
I used two methods. First being comparative analysis, where I extracted important information from Parker's medical records, as well as I used rigor mortis analysis to come to Parker's time of death.
And did you rely to apply those methods to the facts of this case?
I did.
Dr. Lopez, did you have any issues with Dr. Quincy's analysis?
I did take issue with Dr. Quincy's type of OI she diagnosed Parker with, as well as the time of death of Parker Page.
Well, let's start with time of death. What issues do you have there?
Well, Dr. Quincy used liver mortis as well as rigor mortis, that being the chemical changes in stiffening one's body after death. However, the rigor mortis and the temperature did not match up.
What was the issue with that matching?
Well, Parker's body undergoes extreme outdoor conditions, likely doubling the rate of glycolysis, thus speeding up the rigor mortis process, thus suggesting a different time of death. Her internal temperature was likely, under normal conditions, would have suggested an earlier time of death. However, under extreme outdoor heat, this likely made it an earlier date.
Well, based off this difference in the glycolysis, were you able to come up with a different time of death for Parker?
Yeah, I had concluded it was likely between 7 and 19.
And moving on to Parker's conditions, what issues did you have with Dr. Quincy's conclusions on Parker's past medical history?
Well, I do think Dr. Quincy did do well in analyzing Parker's prior medical history. However, I do believe she overlooked some of the symptoms Parker was experiencing, thus resulting in a different type of OI diagnosis for me.
Well, what is OI?
OI is basically when one's bones are more susceptible to breaking, as well as they can bruise more easily. For type 1 OI, patients may have low bone density, frequent fractures, as well as small respiratory issues. This is what Parker was diagnosed with.
And did you have any reason to believe that Parker may have had a different version of OI?
Yes, I concluded Parker had type 2 or type 3 OI, and I found 3 reasons for this. The first being Parker's ongoing respiratory issues, increasing in severity over time. The second being Parker's stunted growth, and the third being the abnormal amount of collagen found in her lungs revealed in the autopsy.
Let's start with Parker's respiratory issues. How would those have been, you able to conclude she had a different type of OI from that?
Well, Parker was diagnosed with asthma in 2011, and her autopsy revealed lung collagen. This likely severe increase in asthma revealed to me it was a different type of OI.
How would Parker's size have led to a different conclusion on Parker's OI?
Parker was 4 inches shorter than the average 12-year-old girl, as well as 10 pounds less. These extreme differences at such a young age indicated to me that it was a more severe type.
And how would the collagen content of Parker's lungs have led you to conclude a different type of OI?
Well, our autopsy revealed an abnormal amount of collagen found in her lungs. It's important to note that less collagen is indicative of OI. However, an abnormal amount found in collagen is indicative of a more severe type of OI.
And how would a different, more severe form of OI had affected Parker?
Well, Parker would be more susceptible to bone breakages, as well as her bruising would appear in more detail on her body. And while engaging in a strenuous activity such as hiking, Parker's lungs would be overworked trying to produce enough oxygen to her vital internal organs, thus causing her to be unsteady on her feet that day.
And why would Parker's OI cause her to bruise more easily?
Well, a common symptom of any type of OI is skin hyperlaxity. And this is when patients bruise more easier, as well as these bruising appear in more detail.
Were there any other factors that might have affected Parker's bruising?
Yeah, so for Parker being a small child, for children, bruising is common in areas of bony prominences. For Parker's bruising, the bruise on her clavicle indicated to me a post-mortem bruise. This is after-death bruising, not antemortem trauma.
And how would that have affected Dr. Quincy's conclusions on Parker's bruising?
Well, Dr. Quincy concluded the bruise on Parker's clavicle was likely antemortem trauma. This is plausible, however, I do believe that due to Parker's advanced form of OI, it's more likely that this was suffered from prolonged pressure against her body, not antemortem trauma.
And moving on to Parker's respiratory issues, how could that have impacted her on the trail?
Well, Parker would likely be suffering from diminished motor skills, and suffering from severe respiratory issues, and like I said, causing her to be unsteady on her feet on the trail, and unable to climb the Leckrone Loop or the trails without assistance.
And how could that have affected Parker's cause of death?
Well, due to these severe respiratory issues, Parker would likely suffer from an accidental fall while hiking onto the trail.
And based off all the evidence that you analyzed, what's your overall conclusion in this case?
Well, my overall conclusion is this. Parker suffered from a more severe type of OI, thus explaining the bruising pattern on the posterior aspect of her body, as well as Dr. Quincy's conclusion is plausible, however, there is a lot of doubt with it. It's not the only conclusion that can be made in today's case. It's certainly likely that Parker suffered from severe respiratory issues, explaining why she fell off the cliff.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Now there's no further questions.
Thank you, Counsel. Cross?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed? Good afternoon, Dr. Lopez. My name is Avery Wright, and I'll be asking you a few questions on behalf of the state. Dr. Lopez, you used to have the position of Chief Medical Examiner. Is that right?
That is correct. I held it for over 20 years.
That's right. You held that position up until 2014.
Correct.
And in 2012, a member of your staff did an autopsy for a homicide case.
Correct.
You learned that they made significant errors in that autopsy,
That was brought to my attention.
but you didn't report it to anyone in your department.
At the time, I did not report it. I tried to analyze it myself and see if I could find any other errors.
You didn't report those errors to the homicide investigators.
Not at first, no.
You didn't report those errors to the prosecutor.
No, I did not at first. I took it under my own hands at the time.
Not only you didn't report it at first, you never reported it at all.
That is correct, unfortunately.
In fact, the defendant, 2 years later, was granted federal relief. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And by that point, you still never told anyone there were errors with the autopsy.
That is correct. However, this does not affect my overall conclusion in autopsy for this case.
Now, you were actually asked if you knew that there were errors in that autopsy.
I was approached by a member of the media. That is correct.
You lied and you said
Objection, Your
no.
Honor. Improper character evidence.
Also,
Pursuant to Rule 608. Uh, 608B, specific evidence, extrinsic evidence is not admissible for a character trait of dishonesty or untruthfulness. This is not a conclusion, this is not a question of Dr. Quincy's ability to perform medical treatment, so that's not going toward dishonesty in a specific case. This is an extrinsic example of dishonesty, and that's inadmissible.
May I respond to that? Rule 608A actually states that a witness's credibility may be attacked or supported through their reputation for truthfulness or untruthfulness. And now, we're not admitting a piece of evidence right now, but it is important to delve into this character for untruthfulness before proceeding.
Response to the Rose Grounds, Your Honor?
go ahead.
Rule 608A refers specifically to an opinion. And this evidence given for untruthfulness is not an opinion. This is an example of an external event that is going for untruthfulness. Therefore, this falls under 608B, which is a specific instance of conduct, and that is listed as inadmissible.
May I respond briefly?
I think this is a specific instance of conduct, so respond on those grounds.
The second part of Rule 608B says, but the court may, on cross-examination, allow them to be inquired into if they are probative of the character for the truthfulness or untruthfulness of the witness. So we're simply asking for the court to allow us to inquire this because it is very much probative of the character of the witness.
Counsel, for either side, can you explain to me the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic evidence? Either one. It's okay if you can't, that's fine. I'll make my ruling, but I just wanted to know.
Right, I'm personally not sure what the difference would be in
Okay.
this case,
All right.
however.
We can talk about it. I think that 608B allows this line of questioning because I think this is directly probative on the witness's character for truthfulness, and so the objection is overruled.
Would you like me to re-ask the question? When you were asked if you knew about the errors, you lied and you said no.
Yes, this was, however, a member of the media. I didn't quite understand why they needed to understand the business that was going on.
Well, your public reprimand soon went public after that.
Correct.
And people learned that you knew there were errors with the autopsy.
Correct.
People learned that you didn't report them.
Correct. And these were all events in the past.
But it caused you to be fired from your job.
Unfortunately, yes. And like I said, these were events in the past.
Now, I actually want to talk a little bit more about your conclusions today.
Okay.
Now, you reviewed Dr. Quincy's report, correct?
Correct.
And you're aware that there are several different types of OI.
Correct.
But Parker, in the past, had been to several doctors.
Correct.
They all diagnosed her with type 1 OI.
Correct.
And Dr. Quincy actually examined Parker's body.
He did.
Dr. Quincy stated that she had type 1 OI.
She did state this, however, I do think there was overlook in some of the symptoms that Parker was experiencing.
Well, Dr. Lopez, you yourself even think it's most likely that Parker has type 1 OI.
Correct, but there is doubt with this, and I do think it is definitely possible for her to have a more severe type of OI.
Out of all the doctors and Dr. Quincy, you're the only one that's ever thought Parker had a more severe form of OI. Is that right?
I can't be sure if I'm the only one, but I did diagnose her with a more severe type of OI, or I thought it was more likely correct.
And just to be clear, you never examined Parker's body.
I was not able to, no.
I want to talk about a couple of the things you mentioned that made you think she had more severe OI.
Okay.
The first thing you mentioned was her height and weight.
That was one of the things, correct?
Parker is only 3.5 inches shorter than the average 12-year-old.
Yes,
She's only 10 pounds lighter than the average 12-year-old.
correct, but these differences do indicate a more severe type.
Well, you yourself in your report said this could very much be within the normal range of growth for a 12-year-old.
Correct, but it is on the lower half, and it did indicate to me a more severe type.
But Parker could have just been small for her age.
That is possible, yes.
You also mentioned the pulmonary collagen in her lungs.
I did.
You stated that the abnormal pulmonary collagen meant she could have type 2 or type 3 OI.
Correct.
But Dr. Quincy actually cut open Parker's lungs and was able to examine them.
Correct.
Dr. Quincy noted the abnormal pulmonary collagen.
Correct.
Dr. Quincy didn't think she had type 2 or type 3.
That is correct, and that's why I said Dr. Quincy had overlooked some of the symptoms.
Now, once again, to clarify, you never got to examine Parker's lungs.
I was not able to, but I did examine Dr. Quincy's report and the autopsy that Dr. Quincy did.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the conclusions. You're aware Dr. Quincy's conclusion for Parker's time of death is blunt force trauma.
Correct.
The only other alternate explanation you have is that Parker could have been having breathing problems.
Correct, and this would have likely resulted in an accidental fall.
Right, because those breathing problems, they would have made Parker pretty dizzy, right?
Correct.
And they would have made her disoriented,
Correct.
probably would have been hard to walk.
Correct.
Now, you reviewed Jordan Ryder's interrogation.
I did, yes.
Now, you're aware that the Lacrone Loop is pretty difficult.
Correct.
And there's tree roots everywhere.
Yes, there's a lot of sticks, branches, rocks, everywhere.
Exactly, and you know that it's about 3 miles to the Lacrone Loop overlook.
I believe so.
So you're telling me that Parker could have walked 3 miles through that difficult trail, all while having breathing problems?
I mean, I suppose so. This wasn't critical to my investigations of it, but I was simply just asked on what Parker was experiencing while on the trail.
So I want to talk more about that bruise on Parker's clavicle. You're aware that Dr. Quincy correctly noted all of the bruises in her report.
Correct.
And this bruise was 2.25 centimeters long
Correct.
and 1.125 centimeters at its widest point.
That is correct.
Now that's a precise half circle.
Somewhat, yeah.
And Dr. Quincy was provided with photos of the campsite,
Correct.
provided with photos of Calkins Campground.
Correct.
She was at the scene that day,
Correct.
but the only thing found to match that precise bruise was the hiking staff.
Correct. And I noted that this could be from prolonged pressure against the hiking staff.
Now, you're aware that the bottom of the hiking staff caused that bruise, correct?
Correct.
So you're telling me that Parker could have had prolonged pressure from the bottom of her staff?
Sure. It's definitely plausible.
Thank you. With that, I have no further questions.
Thank you, counsel. Redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I asked the witness to be able to step down.
Your excuse, sir. Counsel for the defense?
Defense calls Armani Rodriguez. May I proceed? Please introduce yourself to the court.
My name is Armani Rodriguez.
What do you do for work, Mr. Rodriguez?
I am the sole proprietor and the owner of Calkins Campground in Woodlands. It's my own little slice of heaven, kind of like out of a Steinbeck novel, although not so much Grapes of Wrath and more so East of Eden.
How did you come to own Calkins Campground?
When I was a kid, I loved reading, and I wanted to pursue a career in reading and writing. I decided that law would be the option for that, so I went to law school and graduated at the top of my class before accepting a huge job offer in New York City. Turns out law is a lot of reading and writing, but the tort claims and the statutes weren't exactly what I was looking for. I took a page out of Henry David Thoreau's book and decided to go back to nature and do a little bit more reading and writing that I wanted to do. I bought Calkins Campground and I never looked back.
Why are you here testifying in court with us today?
Well, unfortunately, on July 14th and 15th of 2018, a young girl, Parker Page, passed away on my campground.
Did you meet anyone new on the weekend of July 14th and 15th?
I did. I had quite a few people come through that weekend. I remember on the morning of July 14th, I was in the middle of a Hemingway novel, I think, and I heard a knock on the door. I opened it up, and there was a man and what looked like his preteen daughter. As they were filling out the paperwork to rent my campsite 12 for the weekend, I discovered that it was Jordan Ryder and his daughter Parker Page.
Did you make any recommendations to these campers?
Of course, Parker Page could barely stand still and had a huge grin on her face. She looked so enthusiastic, so I recommended they head out to one of my best trails, the LaCrone Loop.
Did you see where they ended up heading after your cabin?
I did. They did the smart thing, and they headed to Campsite 12 to set up their tent before they went out for the day.
Did you ever see them at Campsite 12?
Yeah. I actually went to lunch after I saw them heading off in that direction. But I came back to the campsite probably around 2:45, and I saw them. It looked like they were finishing up their own lunch at that time.
Did you see the two head towards a trail?
Yeah, they headed towards that trail, the LaCrone Loop that I recommended earlier, probably about 3 o'clock.
At any other point in the day, did you see the pair?
Well, I did. In the afternoon, I was trying to do a little bit of my own writing, and whenever I hit a writer's block, I like to go around and walk around my campsites a little, see if I can see some interesting people or things happening outside. to get things going a little bit. And I heard a scream, so I headed down the Lacrone Loop a little ways.
What happened after you heard this scream?
Well, I ran into Jordan Ryder and Parker Page, and I asked them if everything was okay, because it sounded like it had probably come from them. Jordan told me that Parker had just seen a fox and that it had frightened her, which makes sense. We have lots of foxes, and they're frequently popping out of nowhere or stealing people's lunches. So since everything seemed fine, I headed back towards the campsites.
Would you recognize where on the trail you saw Jordan Ryder and Parker Page?
Of course, I've owned the entire campgrounds for about 20 years now, and I walk around them quite a bit, so I know the whole place like the back of my hand.
May the witness step down and make use of the demonstrative. Exhibit 23 already published to the jury.
Yes, you may.
Here you go, Mr. Rodriguez. Would you be able to mark on this map of your campground where on the trail you saw the pair?
Of course, it was just past the trailhead for the Lacrone Loop, which is right here, so it was probably right about there.
Let the record reflect that Mr. Rodriguez has marked with a blue dot just above the Lacrone Loop trailhead where he saw the pair.
The record will reflect that.
Mr. Rodriguez, what time did you see Jordan Ryder and Parker Page?
Well, I normally start my afternoon writing about 4 o'clock, and I think it was a little ways after that, so probably close to about 4:30.
Would you be able to mark with your initials the time that you saw them?
Of course. 4:30, Armani Rodriguez.
Let the record reflect that Armani Rodriguez has marked the time 4:30 and their initials AR.
It does.
Mr. Rodriguez, would it have been possible for Mr. Ryder and Parker Page to have been over by Culkin's Rock Overlook at 4:30?
Well, I've read a lot of interesting books about time travel. Rankin Alone Time, The End of Eternity, Time Traveler's Wife. But given that this is close to 2 miles away and is a pretty difficult trail, there's no way they would have been able to be at Calkins Rock Overlook when I saw them here at the same time.
Objection, Your Honor, to speculation. May I be heard?
Can you explain that?
Yes, Your Honor. While Mr. Rodriguez is free to testify to his own personal knowledge about what he may have been able to do at the Culkins campground, if he would have been able to hike that, we've heard no foundation laid that Mr. Rodriguez can testify if Jordan and Parker would have been able to make it up to the overlook. He can testify as to what he would be able to do physically, but not what Jordan and Parker can do.
May I respond? Your Honor, speculation would be peering into the mindset of Mr. Ryder and Parker Page. This is not the testimony that Armani Rodriguez has laid. Furthermore, Armani Rodriguez has laid the foundation that he's aware of this campground and the distance. He's able to testify to how long it would take someone to hike and whether or not it would be possible within a given time frame to be somewhere.
May I respond on those grounds?
I think that, let me make sure I'm understanding the testimony correctly. You're saying you saw them at that dot at 4:30
Yes,
and that it wouldn't have been possible to be in two places at once, essentially?
essentially.
Okay. I think that's permissible for this witness to testify.
Yes, Your
The
Honor.
objection is overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. You may retake your seat. Now, after this sighting on the trail, did you ever see Jordan Ryder and Parker Page again that weekend?
Well, I saw Jordan Ryder again. I stopped by their campsite 12, around 6:30, and I saw Jordan Ryder. I asked where Parker was, and Jordan initially told me that she was inside their tent. But when I looked in, I didn't see her, so I asked him about it again, and he said that she must have gone on a hike on her own.
Did you ever go back to check and see if Parker returned?
No, checking on them once was already kind of breaks my rule of not running my campsites in an Orwellian manner. So I decided to let them be. I did see a pretty substantial fire going on around 11 o'clock when I went to bed, though.
What occurred when you woke up the next morning?
Well, I normally wake up about 5 or 5:30 and go on a hike of my own. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary, except the phone on our emergency phone was off the hook. I keep that there in case anything does go wrong. The cell service is notoriously spotty out there. But other than that, nothing was unusual.
Did you interact with anyone on the morning of July 15th?
Well, not on my hike, but when I got back to my cabin, there was a detective waiting for me there. She introduced herself to me as Detective Chesney.
And what happened in your interactions with Detective Chesney?
Well, she asked for my help. I like to kind of imagine that she was a Sherlock Holmes, and I got to play the role of Watson a little bit. She showed me a picture of Parker Page and asked me if I'd seen her, so I directed them to campsite 12 where they'd been staying.
And are you aware of what happened next in the investigation?
Well, yes, Detective Chesney was unable to find Parker Page there, so Detective Chesney went to go search the campgrounds, but after maybe an hour or so, she had to come back to find me. It's pretty easy to get lost around my trails if you don't know where you're going or if you've never been there before, especially if you leave the marked trail and try and come back. So I helped Detective Chesney search the grounds.
When you began aiding the search party, did the search ever turn up Parker Page?
Unfortunately, it did, near the Calkins Rock overlook.
Lastly, Mr. Rodriguez, did you ever see Jordan Ryder and Parker Page by Calkins Rock Overlook on the weekend of July 14th and 15th?
No, I never saw them anywhere close. And given that I saw Jordan Ryder at least at 4:30 by the trailhead and 6:30 back at the campsite, I find it very unlikely that Jordan Ryder would have had time to make it there during that time.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. No further questions.
Thank you.
Would the state like me to leave the demonstrative
please.
up?
Ross?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Mr. Rodriguez, I want to start off by talking a little bit about the Calkins Campground. Like we heard on direct examination, you're the owner of Calkins Campground, right?
Of course.
You'd agree with me that you rent out 12 different campsites to prospective campers, right?
As well as 4 cabins.
Right. So you'd agree with me that you advertise your campsites to the public.
Of course, I'm a businessman.
So campsites 1 through 8 would be the closest together, right?
Yes, that is true.
Campsites 9 through 11 are farther away, but they're still close together, right?
Yes,
Campsite 12, Mr. Rodriguez, is the most secluded, right?
of all the campsites, that is true.
You'd agree with me, though, that all of your campsites are perfectly safe, right?
Yes, I think so.
So on July 14, 2018, you were able to interact with the defendant and Parker a few times, right?
Yes, I was.
The defendant wanted to rent a campsite from you.
Yeah, it looked like they were both pretty excited to be out there camping.
The defendant wanted campsite 12, right?
Yes, that is correct.
The defendant told you, Mr. Rodriguez, that I'll take campsite 12. It sounds the most dangerous.
Yes, he did.
So after that, you recommended the Lacrone Loop to the defendant and Parker, right?
Yes, I think that is one of my best loops. It's got some great views along it.
It's a pretty difficult trail, right, Mr. Rodriguez?
It is fairly difficult, but it's just a hiking trail.
Well, that is a yes to my question that it's a difficult trail.
Sure.
I mean, Mr. Rodriguez, it took you could only go from here, the trailhead, to here to reach Jordan and Parker, right?
Yes.
So even though you recommended the Lacrone Loop to the defendant and Parker, even after Parker appeared to look frail to you.
Yeah, I didn't think it was going to be an issue. It did seem to me like they'd probably be moving a little slowly down it and probably wouldn't finish the whole thing, but there are some great views just a little ways down it.
Well, Parker appeared so frail to you that you weren't sure if campsite 12 was the best option.
Well, it's not the best option, but I didn't think it was going to be a problem at all.
So let's talk about your interactions with the defendant and Parker. Like you stated on direct examination, you saw them at about 2:30, 2:45.
Yes, they were finishing up lunch at that time.
And that's when you came back from lunch, right?
Yeah.
You were gone for about 2 hours.
Yeah, I usually go with my brother into town to eat lunch.
During those 2 hours, Mr. Rodriguez, you don't know what the defendant and Parker were doing, do you?
No, I was doing my own writing at that time and was trying to block out all of the distractions.
You don't know if they were able to go out of the Lacrone Loop once.
What do you mean by going?
You don't know if they were able to go onto the LaCrone Loop in those 2 hours that you were gone.
I assume they went on the LaCrone Loop because that's where I saw them later.
Right, so at about 3 p.m., that's when you saw the defendant and Parker head back onto the LaCrone Loop, right?
That's when they first headed out, yes.
Well, you don't know that for a fact, right, Mr. Rodriguez? You don't know if that was the first time.
I suppose they could have. I don't think they would have had time to go very far while I was gone at lunch, though.
But you don't know if that was the first time they headed onto the LaCrone Loop.
No, that's correct.
So at 3 p.m., you saw them head onto the LaCrone Loop, right?
Yes.
And that's when you testified on direct examination that about an hour and a half later, you heard a scream coming from the LaCrone Loop.
Yeah, and when I ran into them, they weren't very far down that loop.
Right, you hurried down the trail and you saw the defendant and Parker.
Yes, that's correct.
When you saw the defendant and Parker, you didn't seem to be too worried, right?
You know, both of them seemed pretty calm, and neither one of them looked hurt at all, so there wasn't any reason for me to be concerned.
Right, that's when you walked away.
Yeah.
You walked away and you could no longer see the defendant.
No, I couldn't.
You could no longer see Parker.
No, I couldn't see either of them.
And then you heard another scream, right, Mr. Rodriguez?
That is true. I did hear another scream. But it sounded very similar to the first one, and I assumed the box just came back.
Right, you don't know where Jordan and Parker were at that time, right?
I don't know an exact location, but given how far they'd gone in the hour and a half, I can't imagine they'd moved very far at all.
Well, I want to be clear, Mr. Rodriguez. After you heard that second scream, the only other person from the two of them that you saw was the defendant, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So at about 6:30, you decided to check in at campsite 12, right?
Yeah, just a brief stop by.
And like you testified on direct examination, the defendant told you that Parker was in the tent, right?
That is what the defendant originally told me.
But when you looked in the tent, Mr. Rodriguez, Parker wasn't there.
No, she wasn't.
That's when the defendant changed his story.
I guess you could say that. He just said that she must have gone out by herself. It looked like he was pretty busy doing his own thing.
Well, the defendant switched from saying Parker was in the tent to saying that Parker had just wandered off.
Yeah.
The defendant didn't ask you for help, did he, Mr. Rodriguez?
No.
Defendant didn't tell you his daughter was missing.
No, of course not.
Defendant didn't seem to be too worried, did he?
Yeah, I don't think the defendant was worried at all.
Right, so then you testified on direct examination that at about 5:30 you saw that the defendant's truck was missing from the campsite, right?
Are we talking 5:30 on the 14th or in the morning?
I'm sorry, Mr. Rodriguez, on July 15th. You saw at about 5:30 that the defendant's truck was missing from campsite 12.
Yeah, well, like I said, I normally wake up pretty early in the morning to go on my morning hike. And when I walked by campsite 12 on my way out the Ziegler path, I did not see the truck there.
And then later that morning, July 15th, you saw that Detective Chesney was interviewing the defendant.
Yeah, I'd actually directed Detective Chesney to the campsite.
And that's when you heard the defendant say that he was asleep in his tent all night,
Yeah, that's correct.
even though you saw the defendant's truck was missing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. At this time, I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, counsel. Redirect for this witness?
No redirect, may the witness step down.
Your excuse, sir, thank you.
Thank you.
Counsel for defense?
Defense calls Jordan Ryder. May I proceed?
Go ahead.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
My name is Jordan Ryder.
Mr. Ryder, I know today is going to be a little bit tough, so we can take this slow. Could you please tell the members of the jury what your relationship was like with your daughter, Parker?
Parker and I had a pretty good relationship. I tried to do my best. I tried to support her in all of her ideas and all of her ventures. I wasn't perfect. I don't think anybody can be, but knowing that what I was doing was my best for my little girl was what made me feel happy.
Mr. Ryder, we've heard a lot of testimony today about July 14th through 15th, when you went to Calkins Campground. Why did you decide to take Parker hiking?
I was away for a period of time and I learned that she was diagnosed with osteogenesis imperfecta. And when I was reading about it, I saw that the best treatment is a good diet and a healthy amount of exercise.
Mr. Ryder, osteogenesis imperfecta is kind of a complicated term. What is this?
It's also called OI, or brittle bone disease. I'm not a doctor, so I can't say any of the exact science about it, but it's basically how it sounds. Her bones are weaker than other people, so she's more prone to breaks and fractures.
So why would you take someone who's prone to breaks and fractures hiking?
Like I said, I was reading about it, and a healthy amount of exercise is something that's going to be better for people with OI, and she begged me to take these dance classes, and I thought they were too dangerous, but she started to really excel, and so I thought it would be a great idea for us to go on a weekend adventure together.
Let's talk about that weekend adventure. How did the camping trip begin for you?
First, we went to Barry's Bait and Tackle Shop. I got some supplies for the camping trip. Then we headed to a cafe just down the road of Calkins Campground, where we started to make some more plans just to make sure we had everything down. I suggested we make that cafe a meeting spot in case we ever got separated. It was open 24 hours, so I thought that would be a good idea, just in case anything were to happen.
Were you there for a long time?
Just enough to grab some food, and then we headed down to the campsite.
What did you do when you arrived at the campsite?
First, I went to the first cabin, which was Armando Rodriguez's cabin, so that I could rent us a campsite for the night.
And what did you do after you rented the campsite?
I then headed down to our campsite, which I had gotten, campsite 12. We set up and made sure we were all ready to go, and then we headed out on a hike.
How did that hike go?
It was a little bit tough, I won't lie. Parker was whining, and she said she didn't want to